And we are back with Shaun Assael, one of the great investigative, one of the great narrative writers of our time, author of a slew of books, including Steroid Nation, for my money, the definitive history of doping in America, which you should go out and read. More recently, Shaun worked on a podcast that I was privileged to work on as well. I was kind of oats to his haul about Wilt Chamberlain called The Big Dipper. Project of Meadowlark Sports Explains the World, which is available on Wondery, Amazon, and other platforms. And also wrote a piece for Politico called How the World's Biggest Basketball Star Helped Richard Nixon Woo Black Voters, about Wilt's political activities in the crazy year of 1968. We're here to talk to Shaun about how a guy who quite possibly is the greatest athlete America has ever produced could nevertheless be an underdog. Wilt, you're the Wilt of your profession. Shaun, thanks for coming on. Thanks for talking with me. Tell me a little bit about what got you interested in Wilt and how he was such an outsider, as great an athlete as he was.
Oh, Peter, it's so nice to be with you again. And yes, I thank you for telling your listeners how privileged you were. You never quite told me that enough, but I knew you were privileged. I was coming off of a book about the boxer Sonny Liston and looking for, frankly, a kind of similar character and somebody who was at the top of his game yet misunderstood and very much of a time that I could go back to, and kept returning to Wilt, who was just dominating. And yet, you want to talk about an underdog, somebody who still holds, I think, something in the order of 24 records, but had been left behind by the times and his league. Certainly had was a schismatic figure, in his era. And I wanted to know more. I wanted to know more about why, when Bill Russell's name is on the MVP trophy, so few people really talk about Wilt anymore, when so many of his records stood. And a lot of that, some of that led me to, as you and I have talked about endlessly, the idea of rings and how meaningful they are. And I know that you've got a whole riff that you go on about, rings being overrated, because once you get in a 7-game series, it's a coin flip, if I quoted you correctly. But with respect to Wilt, it was, that didn't seem like enough of a reason. And it was a journey. And I went on a journey about why Wilt has been forgotten by the modern NBA. And a lot of it led to his politics and the convention in 1968 and Wilt's backing of a Republican, and not just any Republican, Richard Nixon, at the origin moment when the sports world, led by Wilt's arch rival Bill Russell, but also by Sonny Liston's arch rival Muhammad Ali, and then the Jim Browns of the world, and how sports in the year 1968 had found its authentic progressive voice. And
let me just ask you, before we get to 1968, Wilt was so unique in so many, I shouldn't say so unique, but so dominant and so singular a figure in so many ways. He was the first to do a bunch of stuff, right? Like he blazed some trails in being a celebrity as an athlete, as a Black American, because he did things nobody saw before. I mean, it's easy to reduce Wilt to his numbers, but I mean, the man did score 100 points in one NBA game. He averaged 50 points in a season. Before that, he was an Olympic level athlete in multiple sports. He was a great college player, all this stuff. It led him to be a presence, but he kind of had to define that presence for himself, right? I mean, he did commercials, but he couldn't control how his image was used, right? He negotiated contracts personally with owners, but he never quite got what he wanted. Just talk to us a little about like what it was like to have that singular force of personality, but still not really be able to control how he was seen and used.
I might disagree with that just a bit. And by the way, the irony is that nobody actually saw that 100-point game, right? It wasn't filmed. So yeah, as I wrote in one of these pieces, it was kind of left to the pixelization and the imagination of future generations. Look, I would the only maybe daylight in what you said and maybe what we've written is that Wilt did successfully, I think, navigate stardom unlike anybody else, and he became the first establishment Black athlete at the dawn of the television age. yet another thing that he doesn't get credit for, right? I mean, that breakthrough mainstream Black celebrity presence turned him into an establishment athlete at a time where that didn't exist. I mean, you maybe had establishment Hollywood stars, but you didn't have, you had the Floyd Pattersons of the world who were considered the quote unquote good types, right? But Patterson still didn't break through the way Wilt did. He would advertise Volkswagen as their national pitchman. He also owned a bar in Harlem that exposed him to both the culture and politics of Harlem, which became essential. But Wilt, as a Black celebrity, was a new thing, one of the many new things he created, right? I mean, he created the superstar athlete. He would later create the super team in Los Angeles. But before that, helped by Ed Sullivan, helped by that 100-point game, helped by his willingness to go on TV and come to America's living rooms, a 7'1", force of nature in a little box in your living room. I mean, all of that was new for the times. We forget about that now, but Wilt carried that around with great pride. And also, as his career went on, great bitterness that he never got more credit for it.
Yeah, maybe that's all I was talking about. The fact that you can go back and look at the records of the championship series he was in, and one man could hardly do more to win games for his team than Wilt did. But then you match that up with some of the sports writing, and you're right. This is where that whole rings thing, which I like to blame on George Steinbrenner and Michael Jordan, but it goes back to sports writers of Wilt's day saying that there had to be something missing in him because the teammates around him basically weren't good enough to overcome the Hall of Famers that Bill Russell was playing with when you get to the postseason every year. Did that leave him bitter?
I mean, certainly Wilt got tired of hearing that Russell was the better defender, that he was a one-dimensional player, that all he could do was score and be a not dominate. But with respect to Wilt, that word dominate tended to be used in a pejorative and vaguely racist way, right? Like that sort of beastly athlete, all the tropes, all the racist tropes that were used in the 50s and 60s tended to get blended into the idea of dominance. And I know that your podcast and your work is all about dominance, but in this case, dominance tended to be, there's a lot of negativity baked into that cake. So when people called Wilt dominant and Russell more artistic, more forgiving, more inspiring, that's the stuff that really aggravated Wilt. And with each ring that Russell got that he didn't, made Wilt retreat farther and farther into this sort of cloud.
Yeah, and it's interesting, like statistically, why that's so ripe for reevaluation is because later in his career, Wilt had a few years where he didn't have to score every point that his team needed. So he decided quite consciously to play for other stats, for assists and rebounds, and he was just as awesome at amassing statistics related to other skills than dunking the basketball. And that's easy to lose sight of.
And look, I don't know that anybody has followed your work as closely for as long as I have, right? I can recite your work 30 years ago. But I think
Wait, 30 years ago, when I say Shaun's mandatory reading, it's because, he was mandatory reading in my high school journalism class. Sorry. You were in the middle of complimenting me. I shouldn't have done that. Please go continue. Yes.
And I think you should take some credit for finding the analyst who wound up rerunning Wilt's numbers. And I think you should talk for a second. If this is a podcast about dominance and underdogs, the utter paradox of how dominant Wilt was with respect to the numbers you ran, this stat called game score. This is not my thing. This is your thing. You should just talk about how the new game score analysis that you did redefined Wilt's dominance.
Well, one of the things that's interesting about any of these historical figures who deserve some closer reexamination is there are people out there, right, who are putting together old video, old newspaper clips to assemble the equivalent of what we get from modern advanced statistics by doing them by hand from old recordings and old yellowed newspaper clippings. We found a guy named Dan Reed who lives in Ohio who's done that for Wilt, also for Russell and a couple of other players who put together these numbers. And then we were able to extrapolate some of the remaining numbers. Like, if you know how many rebounds Wilt got in 15 games a season, you can kind of project how many he got for the year and how many were offensive and defensive. If you just look at it and use conservative estimates, Wilt was unbelievable across the board, night after night after night, posting game scores, this very basic metric about just summing up a guy's accomplishments in one game, assembling game scores at a higher level more often than anyone ever.
Tell your
And
audience what Jordan's game score was and what Wilt's game score.
well,
Career.
I mean, I think Michael Jordan's career high game score was 69, right? I mean, if you're above 50, or maybe that's the night he scored 69 points. I'm sorry. And
I thought
Wilt
it was
had
39, maybe.
well, Wilt had 80 games better than the highest game score that anyone ever, above that amazing level. It was routine. And I think there's something we talked about called number sense, where if you break a record by a small amount in an intense competition, people will remember you as be a memorable champion. If you just blow, like Roger Maris got years of acclaim and grief for beating Babe Ruth by one home run, right? If you shatter a record, if you're outside the bounds of people's imagination, if people literally can't comprehend what you're doing, then they won't comprehend what you're doing. And they'll ascribe your greatness to, just natural talent. And they'll over-focus on your flaws. This is what happened to guys like Ted Williams and Barry Bonds, neither of whom were necessarily easy to get along with or terrific personalities, but they were so great at what they did that it just didn't compute with people. People had to find another reason to not prefer them. I think that's a lot of what happened with Wilt. Wilt was so great. It was beyond, it's like saying if I gave you $1 billion instead of giving you $1 million, you wouldn't know what to do with the other $999 million. It just stops making sense. And it's very easy to underrate players, athletes of all kinds across all sports who are so great that they blow your minds. I think that's definitely plays into what happened with Wilt.
Just to complete that thought, and by the way, if anybody out there is a publisher and is interested in a Wilt Chamberlain biography, I've got a proposal on my desk ready to go. So all book publishers, please come my way. I just want to add, in what little time we have left, that it was, if you combine all the things we've talked about, that idea of number sense that dilutes any perspective that we may have. What winds up happening is that Wilt becomes also, in some respects, and you see that in part 3 of our podcast, the author of his own fate. Even though he goes to Los Angeles and in the, whatever it was, 72-3 season, wins a championship with the first super team, he retreats literally into his own cloud, right? He builds this mansion in Bel Air and winds up not only just retiring early, but sort of dropping off the NBA radar and not being, and this I think is key, not being especially nice to the successive generations. And Shaq tells the story about when he's a rookie and, Russell reaches out, he runs into Wilt in a restaurant and Wilt gives him the cold shoulder. So I think there was a lot of sort of Wilt authoring his own fate and it being easy for the next generation to kind of dismiss him. And then, of course, by the time you get to Jordan, history is rewritten. And by the time you get to Kobe, who's Wilt again? And that's why I think in the modern NBA, Wilt is, in the parlance of this podcast, such an underdog. It doesn't help, by the way, that at the time Magic Johnson announces he has HIV in 91, Wilt has just come out with a memoir claiming to sleep with 20,000 people. And this, on top of everything else, and this is what I think is bittersweet. And again, for anybody who wants to, me to write the book or us to make the movie, at the time that Wilt is desperately trying to reclaim his legacy, he has, and the irony, right? The man of impeccable timing has the worst timing in the world, because this claim that's really not true and is supposed to just be a joke and sell some books turns him into this awful, ribald, hedonistic figure at a time where that's the last thing the sports world wants, and his reputation never really recovers. He tries, but
well,
He's never able to really sneak back into the public eye, and he dies in 1999 with that part of his legacy unfulfilled.
Well, I'll tell you, it's interesting you bring that up, and it's important you bring that up because Wilt, this great athlete, this all-time great athlete, is so easy in the public imagination to reduce to two numbers, those 100-point games and that 20,000 women. If there's ever someone, we're dedicated to analytics here, but if there's ever someone who needed rescuing and reinterpretation from his own numbers, it's Wilt Chamberlain. So I hope people give that a thought. And I want to thank you for taking so much time to be here and talk with us. I could talk all day. I will talk all day, but that wouldn't help anybody. So I appreciate your time, and I want everybody to go read your Politico story on 1968 and Wilt and Nixon. We're here at the Democratic Convention this week, and go out and learn about Wilt and see what's left about him that speaks to us today. It's an interesting, fascinating story.
Peter, it is impossible for me to say how much I've learned from you over the years. Thank you.
Thank you, Shaun.
Okay, bye everybody.
Come back again anytime.
Will do.